Ladies and gentlemen, the IRR is signed.
We have much to do in our efforts if we wish to further equip our workers or workforce with emerging and in-demand skills that are adaptive to the fast-paced and ever-changing domestic and global economy. With the proper implementation of this landmark act, we will facilitate stronger coordination and partnerships among relevant agencies and stakeholders to help implement programs to raise productivity. We will also strengthen the linkage between industry, the academy, and the government to address skills mismatches and enhance the competitiveness of Filipino workers. Next step is to develop the Trabaho para sa Bayan Act, which shall serve as the country's master plan for generating employment and creating high-quality jobs. To encourage our government partners, the private sector, and various employers as organizations, informal sector workers, and other vulnerable groups to actively participate in the upcoming consultations to develop this master plan.
Ang San Jose National Trade School ay talagang nakinabang ng gusto dito sa PSIP projects sa dahilang ito ay nagsilbing komportableng classroom sa ating mga estudyante.
Or na wala pa po ang PSIP, hindi namin alam kung saan kami lulugar, saan kami magtuturo.
Nagtsatsaga po kami na magturo sa mga kiosk sa loob ng gym, and then sa mga ilalim po ng puno, ganun po ang aming sitwasyon dito. Ngayon po, isang napakalaking pagkakataon po para sa amin na nagkaroon ng PSIP na kami ay pinagkalooban ng mga classroom.
Nung dumating ang PSIP, feeling namin nasa private school po kami. Napakaginhawa po ng naging naranasan ng mga guro, lalong-lalo na po ng mga mag-aaral po namin.
Napakabuti ng Panginoon Diyos at binigyan kami ng pagkakataon ng eskwelahan namin na nabigyan ng ganitong klaseng building.
Sabi nga kapag may komportable tayong classroom, silid-aralan, makakamit din natin o makakamit natin yung talagang quality education na hinahangat po natin. So, perfect po yun para sa amin. Meron kaming masisipag na mag-aaral, may matataas na pangarap na mga mag-aaral, masisipag na mga guro, at dinagdagan pa po yun ng PSIP na napaka-komportabling classroom na building. So, talaga pong ang pangarap ng bata namin, abot kaya po nila.
Para sa mga susunod na mag-aaral ng ating sintang paaralan sa Del Monte National Trade School, maging grateful po tayo dahil hindi na po natin kailangang magklase sa gym or sa baba o sa mga puno, sa mga half circle ng ating paaralan dahil meron na po tayong buildings or classroom na ating maaasahan.
Maraming salamat po sa pamamagitan ng proyektong ito, pinahalagan ninyo ang aming kinabukasan.
Maraming salamat po dahil hindi po isang paaralan po ang binago ninyo, ang napaunlad ninyo, kundi napakaraming buhay ng mga mag-aaral po at pangarap ang naisakatuparan niyo po.
Ladies and gentlemen, the IRR is signed.
We have much to do in our efforts if we wish to further equip our workers or workforce with emerging and in-demand skills that are adaptive to the fast-paced and ever-changing domestic and global economy. With the proper implementation of this landmark act, we will facilitate stronger coordination and partnerships among relevant agencies and stakeholders to help implement programs to raise productivity. We will also strengthen the linkage between industry, the academy, and the government for the skills mismatches and enhance the competitiveness of Filipino workers. Next step is to develop the Trabaho Para sa Bayan Act, which shall serve as the country's master plan for generating employment and creating high-quality jobs. To encourage our government partners, the private sector, and those employers as organizations, informal sector workers, and other vulnerable groups to actively participate in the upcoming consultations to develop this master plan.
Ang San Jose National Trade School ay talagang nakinabang ng gusto dito sa PSIP projects sa dahilang ito ay nagsilbing komportableng classroom sa ating mga estudyante.
Or na wala pa po ang PSIP, hindi namin alam kung saan kami lulugar, saan kami magtuturo.
Nagtsatsaga po kami na magturo sa mga Ah,
All right. So once again, good afternoon, everyone. So I am Kyla Nibigno from the Capacity Building Division of the PEP Center, and I welcome you all to the fundamentals of unsolicited PEP proposals under the PEP Code and its IRR. So this session now is for private sector and PEP stakeholders, as well as the general public. Okay, so before we start, let me, of course, first acknowledge the presence of our participants. So without you, of course, this event could not have happened. So if I mention your company or your institution, kindly send us a heart reaction or a like reaction via the reaction buttons of the Zoom meeting room. Okay, so first, we have participants from the One Document Corporation, also from the Arup Group, also from the Ascent Solutions Philippines Incorporated, from the Cabrera and Company, from the Cebu Cordova Link Expressway Corporation, from the CEST Incorporated. We also have participants from the Cruz Marcelo and Tenefrancia, from DMCI. We also have participants from the EGIS Philippines and from the First Balfour Incorporated. We also have participants joining us from the Gruba Caganda, Advincula, Melo, and De La Fuente, or Gruba Law, also from the Manila Electric Company, or Meralco. We also have participants from the Manila Water Company Incorporated and from the Manila Water Philippine Ventures Incorporated. We also have participants joining us from the Megawide Construction Corporation, from the Metro Pacific Tollways South Management Corporation, and also from the Metro Pacific Water Solutions Incorporated and Metro Pacific Water Investments Corporation. We also have participants joining us from the MPP Mobility Corporation, from the OVE Arup and Partners Hong Kong Limited, Philippine branch, from Polstrom Consulting Incorporated, also from PricewaterhouseCoopers Philippines, from the Rotary Club of Iligan, also participants from the San Miguel Holdings Corporation. We also have participants joining us from the Seed City Consulting, from the Socor Construction Corporation, from the Tipaklong Sustainable Mobility Corporation, from the Tubig Pilipinas Group Incorporated, from the Vasquez Bretanya and Sibal Pulido Law Offices, or VBSP Law, and we also have participants coming who are freelance consultants and those from the general public. Okay, so I welcome you all, and I hope that this activity would be productive for everyone. So if we missed some of the corporations or companies or institutions that are here with us right now, so kindly send in your the name of your institution via the chat box so that we can acknowledge your presence later on. All right? And now to formally welcome everyone to this 3.5 hour rather, activity. May I now call on the Director 4 of the Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Service of the PEP Center, Director Feroisa Francisca T. Concordia, to give her opening remarks. So Director Royce, let's give her a warm round of applause virtually.
Thank you, Kyle. Good afternoon, everyone. We are pleased to welcome you in this online capacity building activity on the fundamentals of unsolicited PPP proposals under the PPP Code and its IRR. This is our second program capacity building activity for this year, and we are happy to have participants from the private sector, non-government PPP stakeholders, and the general public, all gathered with a shared goal of enhancing our understanding of the processes involved in managing unsolicited PPP proposals. We see familiar partners and institutions that have been with us as early as last year when we conducted stakeholder consultations and rolled out the introductory course on the PPP Code and its IRR. So for those joining us for the first time, let me begin by highlighting the milestone in the Philippine PPP program. So the PPP Code, RA, or Republic Act number 11966, was passed last year. It was signed on December 5, 2023, while its implementing rules and regulations was signed and approved by the PPP Code IRR Committee on March 21, 2024. Following the general information dissemination on the code and its IRR in 2024, this year we move forward with a series of capacity building activities designed to delve deeper into the processes and requirements under the development, review and approval, procurement, and implementation stages. So these sessions will be aligned with the code and its IRR and relevant issuances and guidelines by the NEDA Investment Coordination Committee and the PPP Governing Board. One of these CBAs is a subject activity on unsolicited proposals and the major updates relevant to them. To give you a snapshot of the status of unsolicited proposals, right now, since the effectivity of the PPP Code, the PPP Center has received a total of 124 USPs, 60 for national and 64 for local PPP projects. And we are happy to inform you that 100% of all these unsolicited proposals, the PPP Center complied within the 10 calendar day period of doing the completeness check. Furthermore, there are currently 32 national and 43 local unsolicited PPP proposals in the pipeline that are in different stages of the PPP process. So it could be from development or could be under ongoing approval or ongoing procurement stage. Okay, some of these are already actively being assisted by the various units of the PPP Center. As such, we would like to ensure that all PPP stakeholders are well equipped to handle unsolicited proposals by organizing 2 webinars on USPs. So yesterday, we've conducted unsolicited proposals. Our target participants are all government agencies, and today is especially for private sector and the general public. Okay, so today's session aims to guide the private sector and relevant PPP stakeholders on the procedures of submitting an unsolicited proposal and the processes it will undergo, including the specific roles undertaken by the IA or the implementing agency and the review and approving bodies. So as we begin the session, I encourage everyone to make the most of this opportunity to gain valuable insights and ask questions. The knowledge we will share today will help strengthen partnerships between the public and the government and the private sectors and contribute to the successful development and implementation of PPP projects in the Philippines. So thank you once again for joining us this afternoon, and I wish everyone a productive and meaningful discussion. Magandang hapon.
All right, thank you so much, Director Roy. So as mentioned by Director Royce, I hope that we have a productive session today. So if you do have questions later on, we will have an open forum, but you are free to send in your questions via the chat box during the session. So before moving on to the House rules, we would like to also acknowledge the presence of the participants from the House of Daniel Consultancy, as well as from the DM Wenceslao and Associates Incorporated. Okay, so just a few reminders from us. All right, so please kindly watch this short video on our house rules. All right, so I'd like to highlight there that please make sure that you have muted your microphones at all times. And please send in your questions via chat box, as well as those of you tuned in via Facebook and YouTube live streams. So please kindly send your questions via the comment section, and we will address them later on during the open forum. Okay, so to give you an overview of our program of activities for this afternoon, so we have started with the opening activities led by the opening remarks from Director Concordia. So following this, we will now delve deeper into the meat of this activity. So we will first start with a brief refresher on the PPP concepts and processes. This will be done by Director Cyrus Ann ng Santiago. And then following this, we will have the processing of unsolicited PVP proposals. This will be done by Mr. J.M. Marquez later on. And then we will have an open forum to address the questions and clarifications coming from the participants. So afterwards, we will have another session or another topic also under the processing of unsolicited PV proposals. This will be done by Director Pronto of one of our services here at the PV Center. And then we will have another round of open forum for those of you who still have questions before closing the activity for this afternoon. All right, I'd also like to share with you the course site for this activity. So if you haven't explored it yet, we shared it with you via email before. So if you haven't yet, kindly visit the course site for more information on the session, as well as for the presentation materials that will be uploaded after this session. Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds to scan the QR code. All right, so my colleague has also posted the link to the, they will be posting the link to the course site via the chat box. Okay, so now before we move on to the discussions, let me first introduce to you our resource persons for this activity. So our first resource person is Attorney Cyrus Ann A. Nang Santiago, Director 3 of the Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Service of the BP Center. So Attorney Sai, again, is currently the Director 3 of the Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Service of the BP Center. And prior to this post, she served as the Chief of the Internal Affairs Division of the Center's Legal Service. So Attorney Sai was admitted to the Philippine Bar in 2014 after having obtained her Juris Doctor degree from the Ateneo Law School in 2013. So our next resource person is Mr. John Michael C. Marquez, Project Evaluation Officer 4 of the Project Evaluation Division of the BP Center. So JM is a Project Evaluation Officer in the Project Evaluation Division of the BP Center. So this is the division tasked to assess the completeness of unsolicited proposals. So this team is also tasked to facilitate the appraisal and approval of PV projects in the Investment Coordination Committee and the National Economic and Development Authority Board. So he joined the BP Center in September 2024 after earning his master's degree in applied economics at the National Cheng Chi University in Taipei, Taiwan. So JM holds a bachelor's degree in business administration and accountancy from the University of the Philippines and is a certified public accountant. So last but not the least, we have our third resource person, Director John Emmanuel R. Pronto from the Policy Formulation, Project Evaluation, and Monitoring Service. So Director John is the current Director 3 of the Policy Formulation, Project Evaluation, and Monitoring Service of the BP Center. He holds certifications from the APMG International as a PVP professional and from the Corporate Finance Institute as a certified financial modeling and valuation analyst. So as an infrastructure and financial professional, he has 3 years of experience in project appraisal across various sectors, including airport, rail, road, water, and health sectors. He also has 4 years of experience in transaction advisory and business valuation and modeling prior to joining the STEM. So Director John holds an undergraduate degree in economics and finance from the De La Salle University and a graduate diploma in urban planning from the University of the Philippines. So these are our resource persons for this activity. And to introduce our first resource person, please help me welcome to discuss the brief refresher on PPP concepts and processes. Let's all welcome Attorney Cyrus Ann ng Santiago. Attorney Sai?
Thank you, Kyle. Is my audio okay for everyone? Okay, so please present the slides. Ayan. So for this afternoon, I will be giving a brief refresher on PPP concepts and processes. So I note that our attendees, there's combination of institutions that are well versed in PPP concepts, and we see some new faces. So hopefully this refresher will give sufficient background for everyone to appreciate the discussions moving forward. Sige, next slide. So allow me to give you an outline of my presentation. First, I'll be discussing the PPP legal framework, then briefly discuss PPP concepts, then finally, a brief overview of the PPP process for unsolicited PPP proposals or USPs under the PPP code and its IRR. Okay, next. Sige, next. Okay. So generally, the PPP code was signed December 5, 2023. It became effective on December 23 of the same year. Its IRR was signed on March 21 and became effective on April 6, 2024. So the following are major reforms introduced under the PPP code. I will discuss some of them later on, but some I'll discuss during this slide. So it unified legal frameworks for PPPs, which were previously, found in various legal frameworks. It decentralized and streamlined the approval process. There are clearer rules and timelines for unsolicited proposals, which I'll also discuss later on. I want to note that the PPP code now enables a predictable tariff regime that safeguards public interest. To briefly discuss this, essentially, the PPP code now requires regulatory bodies to come up with their own processes make this available to the public. The process for approving tariffs and other regulatory fees, and to have them involved and consulted during project development or prior to project approval, just so there's a predictability in the tariff structure that the PPP project would have. And also institutionalization of PPP good practices and lessons learned. I'll discuss some examples of these, but essentially it makes the most out of the decades of experience the PPP Center has had monitoring and assisting in PPP projects. And we've codified these learnings to make this universally applicable for PPP projects. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, it unified various legal frameworks. As most of you are probably aware, prior to the passage of the PPP code, there were various laws governing PPPs. We had the BOT law, which was applicable for not just national, but local government, and also if you were GOCC, SUC, etc. But then we also had the NEDA joint venture guidelines to cover joint ventures if you were GOCC, SUC, GEC, GCE, etc. Then if you were an LGU, you were empowered to create your own local PPP code or JV ordinances. And then if you were an institution with a special charter, you were sometimes authorized by your charter to create these special rules as well. So now we're saying that the only legal framework that we're going to be considering is the PPP Code of the Philippines. Sige, next slide, please. And why do we say this? If you look at the repealing clause of the PPP Code, it provides that all executive orders and laws, decrees, orders, codes, issuances, rules, and regulations, and or any part thereof inconsistent with or contrary to the PPP code and its IRR have been repealed or modified accordingly. No other JV guidelines, PPP guidelines, codes, or issuances whatsoever may be enacted or issued or used by any government entity to enter into PPPs, except those that may have been enacted, issued, or used in accordance with the PPP code or its IRR. For example, there's a provision in the PPP code that allows an implementing agency, a local implementing agency, to issue a resolution creating or an ordinance creating a tariff regulating body. That is something allowed, and that's something consistent with the PPP code. References to the BOT law are now amended to refer to the PPP code. And finally, local PPP and JV codes and ordinances issued by LGUs have been repealed. So in the off chance that you encounter an LGU that's insisting on applying their own ordinance, we may respectfully inform them that it is now the PPP code that is governing. Next slide, please. Again, PPP concepts. So this is very important for our discussion. It's important to understand the elements of a PPP because essentially this determines whether a project will be governed by the PPP code or another legal framework. So Section 4 RR of the IRR provides that a PPP is a contractual arrangement between an implementing agency and a private partner. This is important because we do receive inquiries where a local government or a national government even will ask whether a particular project is a PPP when in fact their potential partner is also a government entity. So in that case, we clarify that that's excluded from the scope of the law. To finance, design, construct, operate, and maintain, or any combination or variation thereof, an infrastructure or development project and service typically provided by the public sector. So I will discuss this a bit further in the next slide. But the short of it is, it has to be a project or service typically provided by the public sector. If this is not, if this is more commercial or something not typically provided, but by that implementing agency, then it is excluded from coverage of the law. Each party shares in associated risk. Um, we emphasize that the key feature of PPPs is the sharing of risk, and usually that risk, what risk is taken on by what party is dependent on their ability to handle that risk. The DOF has a GPRAM or their preferred risk allocation matrix, which guides implementing agencies and the private partners as to the risk that they are advised or it is preferred that they undertake and why. It also provides mitigation measures to minimize or to contain certain risks that they are required to have. So it's important in a PPP to identify what risks are undertaken by what party. So conversely, if there is no risk at all to the government, then there's a question as to whether that really does constitute a PPP, or if we cannot see what the risks are going to be shouldered by which party, then the PPP Center will have trouble determining or assisting you to determine whether a project is a PPP. Finally, investment recovery is linked to performance. This is also something that we want to emphasize. This means that there has to be an investment recovery tied to performance where payment is contingent on specific output levels or efficiency matrices or other performance-based criteria. So if it is just straightforward paying them without just because it's provided in the contract without reference to any matrix or performance standards or output levels, then we have to to look into that to ensure that that is a PPP as defined. So next slide. So to further emphasize what is a PPP and what's excluded from coverage, so the PPP code explicitly provides that it covers BOT modalities and its variants, JVs as defined in the PPP code, and there is a definition in the law, lease agreements providing for the rehabilitation, operation, or maintenance, including the provision of working capital of an existing, by the private partner of an existing or land or facility owned by the government for a fixed period of more than 1 year. Lease agreements, when such lease is a component of a PPP project, O&M or operation and maintenance facilities, and essentially any infrastructure or development project or service that satisfies the elements of a PPP. So as we know, contract is not defined by its nomenclature, but by the contents therein. So if the elements fall under a PPP, then it should be covered by the PPP code. So the PPP code excludes the following: infrastructure projects and services procured through, in this case, the new Government Procurement Act or RA 12009, management contracts which do not have elements of a PPP as defined, service contracts such as coal, petroleum, and renewable energy service, and service contracts contemplated by the relevant circulars of COA and BBM. This is something that I mentioned earlier, joint ventures and lease agreements involving purely commercial arrangements, which neither provide nor include public infrastructure or development services. So a clear example would be if the infrastructure is for a mall, something like that. This is not, this would likely be construed as a purely commercial undertaking, not involving infrastructure or services typically provided by the government. Although we do understand that certain commercial components may exist within a PPP project. ODA infrastructure, unless otherwise stated in the agreement, divestments or dispositions, corporatizations, incorporation of subsidiaries, onerous and gratuitous donations. So essentially what we want to take away from this slide and the previous one is that if the infrastructure or development project or service satisfies the elements of a PPP, then it shall be covered by the PPP code and it is considered a PPP. Next slide, please. So there are various ways that the private sector can recover their investment. It might be, depending on how a project is structured, a revenue-based PPP, wherein the private partner is allowed to collect charges from users. We see this easily in road projects, such as in toll roads, or bulk water charges in water projects. It could also be availability-based PPPs, wherein this is when an implementing agency will allocate budget or funds as payment to the private partner. So we usually find this in projects where there is no source of revenue for the project itself. For example, a school project. So since we're not charging tuition or other fees from parents and the students, then it will be annual payments by the Department of the Education. Prison project also. This is not something that the private partner can get revenue from independent of the implementing agency allocating funds for it. And then there are other investment recovery schemes. So the private partner may be allowed to explore the commercial potential of a particular project or make the most of contiguous assets or sometimes bundle assets to improve the overall financial viability of a PPP project. So for example, if it is a government building project, then commercial development rights may be allowed. For example, and we see this in rail projects where the private partner is allowed advertising rights on the trains and the stations, because this allows them to supplement revenue streams that allows the project to become more financially viable. So note that a combination of different investment schemes is allowed as approved by the approving body. So you're not constrained to undertake only one form of investment recovery. Next slide. So there are two modes of procurement, as you're aware. Solicited, meaning this is initiated by the implementing agency, and the project is found in their list of PPP projects, which they are required to submit to the PPP Center and to NEDA and to make available to the public. And this is subject to public bidding. We have unsolicited PPP projects, the focus of today's activity, which is initiated through a proposal made by the private proponent to undertake a PPP project. It is subject to a comparative challenge. I want to mention now, although this will be repeated consistently throughout this afternoon, that private proponents may submit their unsolicited proposal to the PPP Center through the USP submission portal, which is found on our website. Any other form of submission will not be accepted nor considered for purposes of a completeness check, which will also be discussed later on. So what we want to emphasize as early as now is that the entry point of projects of unsolicited proposals is now the PPP Center. You do not need to go directly to the implementing agency. Next slide, please. Okay. So now I'll discuss an overview of the unsolicited PPP process. So as you're well aware, these are the same project stages, whether it's a solicited or unsolicited PPP projects. There's the development stage, review and approval, the procurement stage, and the implementation stage. Next slide. I'm gonna mention key items under the PPP code for various stages of a project. So under the development stage, obviously, the private proponent is required to submit a feasibility study, and the PPP code enumerates the item, and the IRR enumerates the items that must be indicated, found in the feasibility study. There's minimum information required. The PPP code provides for the minimum information required: economic analysis, financial analysis, value for money, risk allocation, bankability, social environmental analysis, and etc. Also key to be found in the feasibility study is stakeholder consultations. So stakeholder consultations must be made as early as the development stage. It should be in accordance with relevant rules, in this case, the General NEDA Board ICC procedure on the review and approval of PPP proposals requiring ICC and or NEDA Board approval, as well as the GPPB guidelines for the review and approval of local PPP projects by the appropriate approving authority. So as early as development stage, stakeholder consultation is required. And this will have to be reflected in the submissions of the private proponent. Next slide. Also in the development stage, so as I mentioned earlier, before that. So unsolicited proposals are now allowed for projects, even if they are in the list of PPP projects. This pertains to the list identified by the implementing agency of projects that they wish to be undertaken using PPP as modality. If you recall, there were restrictions as under the previous law with regard to the kind of projects that may be submitted as unsolicited proposal that is no longer applicable under the current framework. So even if the project is without new concept or technology, it may be subject of an unsolicited proposal, subject to any the reimbursement of any development costs that the implementing agency may have already incurred in preparing for, let's say, a solicited project. The development costs of the implementing agency, subject to reimbursement, shall be for the past 3 years, capped at 6% and excluding any role-related costs. The PPP Center, as I mentioned earlier, is the entry point of all USPs. This will be emphasized later, but once it is received by the PPP Center, it will have 10 calendar days to conduct a completeness check to be submitted. And on the completeness check, on the submitted proposal, and to determine the appropriate approving body. After which, if it is found complete, the unsolicited proposal will then be endorsed for the implementing agency for decision. The private proponent may seek a meeting with the PPP Center prior to their submission to clarify the process and or requirements. So the PPP Center wishes to be as facilitative as possible. So if you are intending to submit an unsolicited proposal, you may schedule a meeting with the PPP Center so that you may be guided before you submit and then the period starts. So you can course your request through the email found on this slide. And you can also use the QR codes provided to read about the guidelines on processing USPs under the PPP code and its IRR. And also, we have a checklist of all the documents required for the unsolicited proposal, and you may find it here on the second QR code. So there may be instances where the PPP Center receives more than one unsolicited proposal on a similar project. And for emphasis, this is during the period the PPP Center is required to perform a completeness check. So an implementing agency shall be copied in the acknowledgement letter to be sent by the PPP Center to the first USP submitted. Similar USPs may be entertained within 10 calendar days from receipt of the first USP. All similar USPs submitted and determined complete by the PPP Center shall be endorsed to the implementing agency for detailed evaluation. And all those submitted beyond the 10 calendar day period shall be returned, and they will be advised to participate during the comparative challenge process should the project reach that stage. So for emphasis, this is only on the level of the PPP Center. Whether a project proceeds, that's something up to the implementing agency to decide. Next slide, please. Okay. Well, the PPP Center also has, during completeness check, if the PPP Center determines that the same project has been submitted incomplete on 3 separate occasions, then there's a holding period of 180 days before they can be allowed to resubmit. So this is to prevent just resubmitting without making any changes or modifications to the project. And this is important because when the PPP Center returns us an unsolicited proposal because it is incomplete, we identify what are the projects what are the documents or information that are lacking. So if the PPP Center provides that guidance, we expect that subsequent submissions will be complete. As we mentioned earlier, we try to be as facilitative as possible. If after third submission they haven't, they're still it's determined incomplete, then the project will not be accepted for after 180 calendar days from the third notice that the submission was incomplete. This is hopefully to give them sufficient time to make any necessary changes to the project documents. So detailed evaluation. The implementing agency, and this will be discussed more extensively later on, will have 10 calendar days to decide after the PPP submits. So the PPP center completes its completeness check, endorses the project to the implementing agency. The implementing agency now has 10 calendar days to decide whether to reject the project outright or continue processing, which means continue processing to detailed evaluation. And after that 10 calendar days, once the implementing agency has notified the private proponent whether it has accepted or rejected the project or has agreed to process it further, it then has 90 calendar days to do a detailed evaluation. So once there's detailed negotiation and there's some acceptance at this level, there is a negotiation. Um, the project isn't there yet. Their project will be subject to negotiation. This is when the private party and the government come together to iron out any kinks and concerns they may have with the project. The minimum is 30 calendar days and the maximum is 80, extendable to 150, subject to agreement of the parties. It is only after successful negotiation that the private partner may be issued an OPS or an original proponent status. This is also something new that was introduced in the PPP code, because prior to that, it was as early as acceptance of the project that the private proponent gets OPS. Now it is only after successful negotiation. So the validity of the OPS is 1 year and it is not extendable. And the expiration of that validity period does not affect the OP's right to match in instances where the invitation to comparative proposal was issued after the 1 year validity of the OPS. Next slide, please. So, as we mentioned earlier in the major reforms introduced in the PPP code, we've streamlined the review and approval processes and also provided clearer timelines for each step of the process. So, for national PPP projects, we've updated thresholds for the approval of national PPP projects. So, for it to need to be elevated to the NEDA board, it's 15 billion and above. Anything below that will be approved by the head of the implementing agency or its board as applicable. So please note that there are periods provided for each for the approvals. And then if it's below 15 billion, but there are certain conditions, it may need to go through the ICC. For local PPP projects, it is the local sanggunian or the LUC board in case of local universities and colleges that will approve a project. And this is regardless of cost. So even if it is above 15B, it will be a local approval only. But this is subject to the endorsement of the Local Development Council Executive Committee, which has 30 calendar days to confirm. So after the LDC Execom confirms a project, and then the local Sanggunian or LUC board can approve it or disapprove it. So there are certain instances where additional endorsements are required, particularly by the regional PPP committee, which is a subcommittee of the NEDA Regional Development Council. They may be required to review and endorse a local PPP project if they affect national or sectoral development plans and national projects. And ICC approval may be required if the local project requires an allowable government undertaking or availability payment, which will be sourced from national government funds. But if these are going to be sourced from local funds, then it won't need to go through the ICC. Again, let's be mindful of the timelines provided in the law. Next slide. So during procurement stage, these are some key features. So it may be single stage or two stage as proposed by the IA and approved by the approving body. The PBAC is or the PPP Bids and Awards Committee has the right to decide on the best mechanism in assessing the qualification, pre-qualification of prospective bidders and challengers and in evaluating proposals. So, there's a 30-day freeze period for that there it changes to bid documents are not allowed 30 calendar days before the submission of the bid submission date. There are required review and approval of the draft PPP contract. So for national PPP projects, the PPP Center is required to approve it just for compliance with the approved parameters, terms, and conditions, just to make sure that what was approved was indeed, were indeed correctly included in the draft contract. The relevant statutory councils of the IA for compliance with applicable laws, rules, and regulations, and the Department of Finance for national government undertakings or availability payments under the PPP contract. So there are also clear protest mechanisms found in the PPP code. There's a maximum of 45 calendar days. It also provides for the grounds for protest, which is failure of the procurement process to comply with the law, violation of the rules to select the private partner, and also evidence of corruption, bribery, bid rigging, collusion, or fraud. So the general process are also provided. The motion for reconsideration to the PBAC, the appeal to the head of the implementing agency, and an appeal to the department secretary as allowed. So there are also processes and timelines set in the PPP code. Next slide. So this is also for the procurement stage. So for solicited PPP projects, the 90 calendar days from notice of award, you have to issue the invitation to pre-qualify and bid. The total for the procurement period is 1 year. For unsolicited projects, you have to issue the invitation for comparative proposal 7 calendar days from notice of the approval of the project, 20 calendar days from the issuance of ICP, prepare and issue the comparative challenge documents, and then the challenge process. It's a minimum of 90 days to a maximum of 1 year. And there is a right to match in unsolicited PPP projects. And then the evaluation of the bid might be separate. So technical proposal, 30 days, 30 calendar days, financial proposal, 15 calendar days, or if the project warrants a joint review, then they have the implementing agency has a total of 45 days from the day bids are open to conduct an evaluation. And then the rest will follow the traditional process, the normal process, recommendation to award, the notice of award, the award of the NOAA, the issuance of the NOAA, compliance with conditions precedent, as required in the NOAA, determination of compliance thereof, and then the execution of the PPP contract, which the PPP Center should be copied. Next slide, please. So finally, with the implementation stage, I mentioned earlier that there are best practices that we adopted from learnings. So one of which is the use of independent consultants. This is during implementation stage. It should commence within 30 calendar days from the signing of the PPP contract or a date deemed appropriate based on the requirements of the project. The cost of procurement shall be shared equally by both parties. There's a mandatory submission to the PPP Center of copies of all executed contracts and project documents. This is to ensure that the PPP Center is properly monitoring and giving necessary guidance or flagging concerns prior to problems escalating, concerns with the project escalating. The PPP Governing Board is currently developing a framework for monitoring and reporting the progress of PPP projects. We also require now a contract management plan, which includes the agreed project execution plan, conflict mitigation plan, and risk mitigation plan, and any updates thereto. And these must be submitted to the PPP Center as well. Finally, variations, expansions, or extension, of course, allowed, provided that it goes through the correct approval process, and who the approving body is dependent on the nature of the variation, sometimes the cost thereof. Um, no approval means the variation is void, and obviously splitting of proposed variations, extensions, or expansions is prohibited. So I think that's my last slide. Next. Okay. So thank you. I hope that refresher was useful, and I'm turning it back over to Kyle.
All right, thank you so much, Attorney Sai. So please, let's give Attorney Sai another round of virtual applause. Okay, so Attorney Sai will also be still be here later on for the open forum. But before that, let me introduce now the second speaker. So our second speaker will now be talking about the process of unsolicited PP proposals. So let's all welcome Mr. J.M. Marquez. JM?
Good afternoon. This is JM from the Project Evaluation Division, the division tasked to assess the completeness of an unsolicited proposal, or USP. So next slide. So next slide. So my presentation will be divided into 4 parts. So first is overview of a completeness check. When we say completeness check, what does it mean? And how do we consider a proposal as complete? Second, completeness checks at different stages of a PPP project, giving a brief overview of the different completeness checks. And then third, I will run you through the list of documentary requirements for determination of completeness. And lastly, an extensive discussion of the requirements in 3. I will also highlight some concerns we encounter when we do completeness check, and provide best practices so that the private sectors can apply in their USP submission. Next slide. So overview of a completeness check. Next. So what is a completeness check? By the word itself, we check for completeness of documents we receive to ensure that all essential information and documents are present and compliant. So more important question is, what's the purpose of a completeness check? It's to make sure that the reviewing or approving body will have sufficient information to conduct a project evaluation and facilitate informed decision. Next slide. So in the completeness check process, the PPP Center determines if a submitted proposal is complete. And when we say complete, we look for 2 things: completeness in substance and completeness in form. So completeness in substance, meaning what's listed in the requirements under the completeness checklist should be all provided. Example, under the feasibility study, there are items on key success indicators of the project. So that should be provided. Stakeholder analysis, so that should be provided. So basically, all of the listed requirements in the completeness checklist should be provided. And then completeness in form. So we have templates and forms, and these templates and forms summarize the project details, parameters, terms and conditions, risk allocation, etc. And these templates and forms should be properly filled out as these will be submitted to the reviewing or approving body. And as far as the PPP Center completeness check is concerned, if the information or document submitted complies and is responsive to the requirement listed in the checklist, it should be okay. We don't evaluate if the information provided is correct. Our assessment is more of an absence, presence of information. Next slide. Now we move on to the different completeness check stages of a PPP project. So, well, the focus of my discussion is on the PPP Center completeness check. I will just briefly run you through this flowchart, which was previously discussed by Attorney Sai. So, in total, we have 7 completeness checks. Let's focus on the boxes with yellow broken lines. So, the first completeness check is for USP, unsolicited proposals, whether national or local, it has to go through the PPP Center. So PPP Center is the entry point for all USP. And with the implementation of the PPP Code and IRR, PPP Center now conducts the completeness check and determination of the appropriate approving body. And as of now, we have conducted more than 120 unsolicited proposals. And once USP is determined complete, so the implementing agency or IA decides to accept or reject the USP after its initial assessment. Then IA will conduct a detailed evaluation at step 2, then negotiation at step 3. Once successful negotiation, IA to grant OPS, original proponent status, to private proponent in step 4. And on step 5, so IA will submit a complete proposal to the appropriate body. And this is whether step 5, so after step 5, this will branch out if it's national or local. And for national approval, it will depend on the project cost threshold. So if the project cost is above 15 billion, it has to go through the ICC NEDA board at step 5A. If the project cost is below 15 billion, the approving body is the governing board, head of mother agency, or head of IA at step 5B. And there is a completeness check at each stages. So in this slide, we already have 3 different kinds of completeness check. Next slide. And then this slide is mainly for local PPP projects, which was already discussed by Attorney Sai. So take note that the green border is for specialized cases only. So the 4th completeness check is at step 6C. So in case a local PPP project affects a national or affects national or sectoral plans, so LGU or LUC must submit the proposal to the regional PPP committee or RPPPC so it can check alignment of the proposed PPP project to the national plans. And before the RPPPC can evaluate the proposal, so the RPPPC Secretariat shall do completeness check within 7 calendar days. And then 5th completeness check is in case the local PPP would need a government undertaking or availability payments sourced from national government funds. So it should go through ICC. And before that, the PPP evaluating units composed of PPP Center, NEDA, and DOF will conduct a completeness check. So I'm highlighting that these 2 steps are for specialized cases only. And then after getting the RPPPC endorsement and ICC approval, it must now be submitted to the Local Development Council or LDC for confirmation that the project is in line with the development plans of the local government units or the local university and colleges. But before the confirmation of LDC, so LDC Secretariat will conduct a completeness check at step 9C. So that's the sixth completeness check. And lastly, last completeness check is conducted by the Secretariat of Sangguniang before full evaluation of the local Sangguniang. So if you will notice, all completeness check process are within 7 calendar days, except for the PPP Center completeness check, which is 10 calendar days embedded in the PPP code. Okay, next slide. So for the list of documentary requirements for determination of completeness of a PPP project, next slide. So this slide highlights which requirements are applicable for each scenario. So the requirements will also be discussed in detail in the succeeding slides. So on the first column listed here are the documents. So what appears in the completeness checklist. Second column is a checklist of unsolicited proposals conducted by the PPP Center, which is the focus of this session, highlighted in yellow. And then third column, checklist for ICC or NEDA board approval. And then fourth column is the checklist for local unsolicited proposal. So what's important to note in this slide is that you can see in item 4, electronic copy of the value for money model. So among the documents in each scenario, so this is the only item that is not required. And why? What is a value for money model? So value for money or VFM model discusses if a PPP project is better being procured via PPP versus the government procurement process. So in the government perspective, you will only proceed a PPP proposal if it's cheaper doing it via the PPP modality rather than the government procurement process. And for you to be able to conduct that value for money VFM analysis, you need data from the government. That's why at the PPP Center completeness check stage, this is not required, as the private proponent does not have the government data yet at this stage. However, when it comes to approval of the project, the expectation is that the implementing agency has already conducted the VFM analysis, since they have the cost data based on their operations, and they also have the PPP data based on the proposal of the private proponent. Next slide. So item 8 is required for all. And then if we look at items 9 and 10, item 9, electronic copy of the financial model of the GOCC with and without the project. And 10, copy of the board resolution approving the proposed project. So these are only applicable if the project is to be implemented by a GOCC. So these are required only for PPP proposals where the IA is GOCC. This is not applicable at the USP completeness, at the PPP Center completeness check stage, given that the private proponent does not have data on GOCC financials. And if you notice that this is only required at ICC NEDA board approval, in case the IA is GOCC, and of course at the local setting for local proposals, these are not applicable. Item 11, original proponent status by the implementing agency. So this is only applicable if the project was already evaluated by the IA and that there is already a successful negotiation. That's why OPS will be granted. And this is at a later stage. That's why not required at the PPP Center completeness check. 12 is Agency Project Evaluation Report, or APER. So APER is a justification of the implementing agency why the project is needed. Basically an assessment of the financial economic analysis of the project. And this is also at a later stage That's why not required at the PPP Center completeness check. 13, draft contract. So for PPP Center completeness checks, the private proponent is already required to submit the draft contract, and it will just be further refined during the negotiation. And this is not required, if you can see in the third column under the ICC NEDA board approval. It will only come up under the list of parameters, terms, and conditions in one of the completeness check forms, particularly CC completeness check form 5, CC form 5, which will be the basis in drafting the draft contract. And the drafting of the draft contract will happen once the project is approved and the PTCs are already locked in. For 14, Private Proponent Information and Qualification Form, or PPIQ form. So this summarizes the legal, technical, and financial capability of the proponent. And then last item 15, endorsement from the Regional Development Council and approval from ICC. So as discussed earlier, so if a project impacts national plans or projects, it will need endorsement and approval. So the proof of endorsement is required, and this is only applicable for local PPP proposal. Next slide. So the list of documentary requirements are more of a high level. So what's required, what's not required. So we move on to the extensive discussion of the requirements, highlighting some of the common concerns, best practices that the private sector can apply. And it will also be helpful if we have the PPP Center completeness checklist open with you, available at the course site, so you can be guided throughout the discussion. So the first requirement is the cover letter. So the contents of the cover letter are enumerated herein. So project name. So the cover letter must contain the project name. And based on our experience, there are instances that there are inconsistencies in the project name. For example, the private proponent presented in the cover letter a project name as Project ABC. However, we saw in other submitted documents, for example, in feasibility study, a different name, which is Project ABCD. So project name should be consistent throughout the project documents submitted. B, description. So the cover letter must contain an overview of the project, outlining the project's purpose, scope, objectives, and C, expected output and outcome. So the letter must contain what the project aims to deliver, what the project aims to complete, and both expected output and outcome must be present in the letter. If either expected output or expected outcome is not present, this item will be tagged as incomplete. So example, for water projects, expected output is a province-wide water facility with a target capacity in terms of million liters per day, while expected outcome is to consistently provide clean source of water for a healthier community. So expected output and expected outcome should be present. D, contract period. So this pertains to the duration of the project. And then E, list of all documents being submitted. So the cover letter must include the list of documents uploaded in the portal, in the USP submission portal. And a separate document attached to the letter may also be considered. And then G, certification that the proposal does not possess prohibited government undertakings. So this requirement pertains to a statement in the letter or a separate certification Um, so, and the certification does not need to be notarized. And if you look at the right-hand side, in the green check mark. So for number one, for USP submitted to the PPP Center, the letter would come from the private proponent addressed to the PPP Center. And for number two, for the required certification in item G, so as mentioned, the certification can be included as part of the letter, as part of the cover letter. And in some instances, it was submitted as a separate certification. As long as in substance, it can be found in other parts of the submission, it will be tagged as information provided. Next slide. So the second requirement is the feasibility study, so which contains these contents enumerated. These are also further breakdown with sub-items in the completeness checklist. So for A, problem definition and statement of objectives. So the feasibility study, or FS, should discuss the problem being proposed to be addressed by the project. And then the statement of objectives should be, of course, linked to the identified problem. And then for project description, so the project description should discuss the scope of work, including descriptions of the project components, and the project description should also include the project location. And in cases where the project location is not yet determined, not yet finalized, a disclosure explaining such may be considered. And still under the project description, area of service or influence, including target users. So this pertains to the catchment area of the project, including target users and beneficiaries of the project, and the products of and services, including and the project description should also include the products and or services, including specification. So for example, for water projects, the product is treated water. And then the specification is million liters per day per pump. So for example, and then C, key success indicators of the project, which should be verifiable and measurable, and means of verification. So how to verify these key success indicators, and key assumptions, including basis and references. So for example, for a road project, the key success indicator could be to improve the traffic flow. And means of verification can be by using the vehicle congestion ratio. And key assumptions, including basis and references, could be, according to industry standards, a good vehicle congestion ratio indicating an improved traffic flow with minimal congestion is 0.7 vehicle congestion ratio. So this is the key assumption. So that should be provided in the FS. And D, assessment of the PPP contractual arrangement options considered and or assessment of the proposed contractual arrangement. So and or, so it can be either one of the two. So this can be a discussion why it is most beneficial to undertake the project under this PPP contractual arrangement. And then E, project context in the government's proposed implementing agency's overall strategy, sectoral program context, regional spatial context. So this refers to a discussion that the project is aligned with the implementing agency's development plans and programs. And then for F, analysis of technical solutions, including analysis of risks and impacts. So this covers the proposed solution of the project design, the chosen technology, of the project. So this requirement should also include the technical risks applicable for the project, as well as the measure to mitigate that risk. And for G, stakeholder analysis and stakeholder plan. So stakeholder consultation is not yet required at the PPP Center completeness check stage, because the private proponent may not have yet been in talks with the implementing agencies. We encounter submissions that the private proponent submits. We're able to provide private consultations. So they can provide the result of the private consultations. So this is acceptable. And it's important to note that if the stakeholder consultations have already been conducted, the results, including the methodology used, the timeline, sample size, the information on the stakeholders, their concerns, proposed measures to address such concerns should be provided. If the consultations have not yet been conducted, the stakeholder analysis and stakeholder plan are required. So the plan should include when and how the consultation should be conducted. So if the submission has no timeline as to when the consultation shall be held, it will be tagged as incomplete. For each project cost, so the project cost should clearly indicate the breakdown of project costs. So there are instances that the submission only provides one number for project cost, and there's no breakdown how much is the cost of construction, how much is the cost of equipment, cost of land and right-of-way acquisition. So we declare this as incomplete. So a breakdown of cost items help the evaluators review the reasonableness of the costing. And then on the slide, if you move to the right-hand side of the slide, green check mark. So the information in the feasibility study should not be older than 3 years as of the date of submission. So however, if there are information older than 3 years, an explanation or justification on the use of such is required. So for example, if there are census data in doing the financials, and recall that the census data is only available every 5 years, and the latest census data is 2020. So as long as the private proponent can provide justification on the data limitation, it will be tagged as information provided. And then stakeholder analysis may or may not have been conducted during the completeness check by the PPP Center, but they are required at the succeeding stages of the project. And then 3, project costs should indicate the breakdown of the project costs. Next slide. Second slide on the feasibility study, I on legal due diligence. So the FS should discuss not just the PPP legal frameworks, but also sectoral framework as applicable. And then under this line item, it also includes institutional analysis. Basically a discussion of the involvement of all government agencies in the project. J, demand and supply market analysis. So this is a discussion on the existing demand, projected demand, and assumption, including basis and references in the demand forecast. This should also include information on alternative products and or services available to users, including the market shares of potential competitors providing that alternative products and or service. And on K, financial analysis. So financial analysis, this is a discussion of the financial viability of the project. the project's profitability. So I will discuss this in detail in the discussion of the financial model. So this item should discuss how the proponent plans to recover its investment. So the information in the financial analysis, in the feasibility study, should be consistent with the financial model. And then for L, economic analysis. So this is a discussion on the economic viability of the project. So the project's desirability in terms of its contribution to the society. So I will also discuss this in detail in the discussion of the economic model. Again, the information in the economic analysis in the FS should be consistent with the economic model. For M, project safeguards. So this includes safeguards in terms of environment, climate change, sustainability considerations. So this discusses the project's potential impact to the environment, climate change, and should also include proposed measures to mitigate the effect of the potential impact. This also include in terms of equity development benefits. So this discusses the benefits of the project with respect to gender, equity, disability, and social inclusion, or GED-C. So the GED-C should also include the proposed safeguard measures. And then there are also other considerations such as safeguards in terms of cybersecurity and workplace standards. And for N, risk allocation and risk mitigation plan. So this requirement should discuss all applicable risks and proposed mitigating measures for the project. And in one of the completeness check forms, particularly on completeness check form 3, CC form 3, this form lists down the proposed risk allocation and risk mitigation plan. So this requirement may contain information disclosed in the completeness check form 3 and should be consistent. And O, on information on job creation, employment impact of the project. So there is a sub-item in the checklist on disaggregated data on sex and disability. So on the experience of the PPP Center, visually, only disaggregated data on sex was provided. So by disaggregated data on sex, for example, out of the 100 people that will be hired, 30 should be men, 70 should be women. So that's the disaggregated data on sex. Now, under the PPP code and IRR, disaggregated data on disability is required. So a lot of private proponents have been asking how to comply with this requirement. And as shown here in the green check box, for the PPP Center completeness check, a catch-all statement indicating equal opportunity hiring, regardless of gender and disability, would suffice. However, for on approval, for national and local approval completeness checks, as indicate actual disaggregated data on sex and disability is already required, given that the proposal is already firmed up prior to the approval. Okay, next slide. So the third requirement is the economic model, electronic copy of the economic model. So what's an economic model? So this model establishes the economic viability of the project. So for example, in road projects, will it generate enough time savings? Will it result to a decrease in vehicle operating costs? So the economic model takes into account the economic benefits of the project at item A, also the economic costs of the project at item B. For C, conversion of financial cost to economic cost using ICC prescribed shadow factors. So basically, on the financial costs, there are conversions using shadow factors for the financial cost to be economic costs. So this is only applicable if there are unskilled labor or foreign cost component to the project. If there are no unskilled labor or foreign cost component for the project, if not required, this should be represented and clearly indicated in the submission. And then for D, the economic model should have calculations of the economic viability, such as economic IRR, economic NPV, benefits cost ratio, and then lastly, the sensitivity analysis. And then moving on to the right-hand side, in the green check mark, the economic model should have an assumption sheet, including basis references for all hard-coded values. So what's an assumption sheet? So this contains the inputs used in the calculations of economic analysis. So for example, an assumption could be exchange rate. For example, $1 is 55 Philippine peso. And this assumption may be a hard-coded value in the model, but should be supported by proper bases and references. For example, the basis or reference for the exchange rate is Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So a proper basis and references should be presented. And this is related in the item 1 in the red X box. If an assumption is hard-coded values with no basis or references, it will be tagged as incomplete. So going back to item 2 in the green check, green box. So the model should be in traceable formula format. So I will discuss this in detail later with examples. And then 3, so same with the feasibility study, the information should be up to date and not older than 3 years. If older than 3 years, they should provide justification. And then 4, all values should be in Philippine peso. And then going back to the X mark, red box. So for item 2, shadow wage rate and shadow exchange rate were not incorporated. So this is related to the item C in the contents of the economic model on the conversion of financial costs to economic costs. So if the shadow factors were not applied, which can be seen in the economic model if the proper conversion has been incorporated. So if not applied, it will be tagged as information not provided. And then item 3, cells linked to external Excel files, not part of the submission. So if you're familiar with Excel, you can link one cell in an Excel file to another Excel file. And there are instances that the submitted Excel, there are cells linked to another Excel file, which is not part of the submission. So in that case, we tag this as not compliant. Next slide. And then on the financial model, so which assess the financial viability of the project's profitability, and the project's ability to meet its debt service obligations. So the financial model should include the financial statements. So for A, the balance sheet, B, income statement, C, cash flow statement. And what's important to note here is that the financial statements should be for its full life cycle. Full life cycle. For example, if the contract period is for 10 years, the financial statements should be also for 10 years. And then D, calculations on financial viability. Is the project financially viable? So a calculation on the project IRR, NPV, WACC, etc. And then sensitivity analysis. And then on F, amount and schedule of firm liabilities of the implementing agency to the private proponent. So if there are availability payments or subsidy coming from the implementing agency, it should be clearly indicated in the financial model. So this item F is also listed under one of the completeness check form, particularly on completeness check form 2, which I will show later. And then G, calculations on bankability. So a computation of the debt service coverage ratio, or DSCR, to assess if there are loans to be availed, will the project be able to pay off the loans. And then H, for JV projects. So the proposed profit sharing between the IA and the private proponent should be clearly presented in the financial model. And then on the right-hand side, so this was already discussed in the economic model portion. So these are the best practices for a good model. Okay, next slide. So here I will discuss what we meant by proper bases and references. So in the check mark, in the green check mark is a good example or best practice. So the picture is an assumption sheet which contains all the inputs used in the calculation. So if you look to the last column under comments notes, they were able to provide the basis references for the assumptions. So this is a terminal project. And for example, let's look at the terminal fee on PACS under transport revenue header. So it's assumed at 20 pesos per person. And the bases and references are provided. It says here, benchmarked on fees collected by existing terminals, VAT exclusive. So this is a good example of an assumption supported by bases and references. And then inside the red box, the red X mark, they were able to provide the assumptions. However, the bases and references under the comments notes were not provided. So the evaluators, reviewers do not know the origin of that data, of that assumption. So in this case, we tag this as incomplete. So emphasizing again that the hard-coded values should be supported by proper bases and references. Next slide. Here, as discussed earlier, the model should be in traceable formula format. So what do we mean by traceable? So a good example is the check mark. If you notice, all line items under current assets, non-current assets are linked to relevant worksheets. So it's easily traceable. While here in the X mark part, this is not traceable since the cells are hard-coded values. So it's good to share also that there are instances that while the cell is linked to relevant worksheet, sometimes the formula of that cell includes a hard-coded value. For example, if we look in the green check mark under column F, cash and cash equivalents. So the cell's formula, the relevant worksheet, ISCFBS multiplied by 20%. And that 20% is hard-coded and not supported by any basis and references. So this is not traceable. And we tag this as incomplete. So in the project evaluation division, we check every cells and the formulas if indeed the hard-coded values have proper basis and reference. And in reviewing the models, especially Excel files, we should be able to trace how the value is calculated. For example, this cash and cash equivalents in the green check mark, it is linked to a relevant worksheet, which is the financial statement. So possibly derived from the ending cash balance of the cash flow statement. So traceability of the model helps the reviewers in evaluating the robustness, the reasonableness of the models. Next slide. So next requirement is the completeness check forms or CC forms. So these forms summarize the project details, the proposed parameters, terms and conditions, financial obligations of the government, and the proposed risk allocation and mitigation. So these forms help the approving body for easier evaluation. So for the best practice, no, at the right-hand side, all CC forms must be fully accomplished. If an item is not applicable for the project, it should be indicated in the CC form. And it's important to note that the contents of the submitted CC forms should be consistent with the contents of the other submissions, of the other submitted documents. Okay, and then next slide. So this is a snapshot of the completeness check form 1, which is the proposed general parameters, terms, and conditions. So this includes the general information of the proposed project. And so this is a long list. And as indicated in this form, in the last column of the form of the table, describe the proposed PTC to the extent that will aid the detailed evaluation of the IA. So this form will also be the basis during negotiation between the private proponent and the IA, and this form also details all the agreements between the private proponent and IA and will be up for approval by the approving body. Next slide. On CC Form 2, which contains the government undertakings and other financial obligations of the government as applicable. For example, for a joint venture project, the implementing agency will be contributing a land to the project. So this should be included and clearly stated in the form, along with the valuation of that land and the compensation to be paid by the proponent to the implementing agency. So essentially, this CC Form 2, all government contributions, government undertaking will be enumerated in this form. And this is the reference, if you recall, on the amount and schedule of firm liabilities of IA to the private proponent. So this will be the reference. Next slide. On completeness check form 3, the proposed risk allocation and risk mitigation plan. So this is a long list of risks based on GPRAM, the generic preferred risk allocation matrix. So the GPRAM identifies the party that could best handle the risks involved in undertaking a PPP project. So as you can see in 1, 2, 3, in the fifth column, is it G, government, P, proponent, or P and G, private, government and proponent? So if the identified risk allocation in the fifth column deviated from the GPRAM, so the details including justification of such deviations must be provided. And all line items, all fields should be filled out. If not applicable to the project, it should be properly indicated that it's not applicable. Because if not properly filled out, if there are missing items, cells which were left blank, we tag this as incomplete. And then next slide. For completeness check form 4, this details the identified interconnectivity and interface risks and mitigating measures. So this form indicates if the project has any interconnectivity or interface risks by ticking the appropriate box, yes or no. And if yes, then provide the required details in the table. And you can see here in the last column, if there is an identified risk, what is the proposed plan to address the identified interconnection or interface? Okay, next slide. And for completeness check form 5, which lists the mandatory provisions of a PPP in the draft PPP contract. So mandatory meaning required in the draft contract that the listed provisions should be included in the draft contract. So there are instances that the private proponent indicates that this provision will be only filled out during negotiation. So as long as it's represented, clearly indicated, it will be considered. Again, if there are missing items, fields which were left blank, we tag this as incomplete. And next slide. So next requirement is the valuation report. So for A, for USP containing government undertakings in the form of payment of right-of-way related costs and or contribution of assets, properties, evaluation of the government assets or property is required. If there are contributions by the IA, so evaluation of is required. Why? The purpose of valuation is to establish the appropriate compensation that the government shall receive, and the IA shall receive equal or more than the amount of its contribution to the project. For B, valuation for joint ventures, valuation of equity contribution of the government and the private partner. So in the same concept, whatever is contributed by the IA in the joint venture, the IA should receive proportionate share in its contribution in the joint venture. So for example, if it contributed 50% of the project cost in the JV, it should receive 50% of the profits. So that's the rationale for the proportionate share for the IA's contribution. And then lastly, for C, for projects where the investment recovery scheme involves the grant of a portion or percentage of reclaimed land, if there is a reclamation in the project, a valuation of the reclaimed land is required. So moving on to the right-hand side, what's important to note is for PPP Center completeness check, the valuation may or may not be determined by a third-party appraiser. So a third-party appraiser is not required at the PPP Center completeness check stage. And however, for approval completeness checks, the valuation should be determined by a third-party appraiser. So a third-party appraiser is already required during the approval completeness checks. And lastly, cash contributions do not require valuation. Next slide. And for project site plan, what's important here is the ownership of the project site plan. Is it privately owned or government owned? So this will be the basis to determine if it's a contribution of the IA or not. Then if contributed by the IA, then intuitively a valuation would be required as discussed in the previous slide. It's important to note here that the project site plan should clearly indicate which government agency owns the proposed project site. So if ownership of the project site is not specified in the submission, we declare it as information not provided. Next slide. So the draft PPP contract must contain all mandatory provisions, which is also indicated in the completeness check form 5. So basically, completeness check form 5 will be a reference to determine if the mandatory provisions are complied in the draft PPP contract. And next slide. So on the private proponent information and qualification form, or PPIQ form, so this form provides information on the private proponent's legal, technical, and financial qualification. So this form should be properly and clearly filled out. So if you look at the second photo, under the list of requirements to establish the qualification, so answer the boxes below. Is the document submitted, yes or no? So for example here, 1 yes, 2 yes, 3 yes. If yes, we look if the document was really provided in the submission. If there are supporting documentary requirements under this form, which the private proponent indicated yes, but not provided, we will tag this as incomplete. And then next slide. So for the common concerns of in PPIQ form, so noteworthy here is inside the red X box. So proof that the entity. So to establish technical eligibility, a proof that the entity has successfully undertaken projects similar or related to the proposed project is required. There are instances that the submission is just a list of projects undertaken. So we cannot verify the authenticity of that list. So this is not acceptable. And then pictures are also not acceptable as proof. We require proof, for example, it can be a certificate of completion, certificate of acceptance, a contract, or any legal documents which serve as proof that the entity has successfully undertaken a similar project. And then for 3, audited financial statements should be the most recent, And for 4, pickup license, so a pickup license is required if there is a construction. So if the pickup license is not provided, or if the license is already expired, this is information not provided. So again, all fields in the PPIQ form should be filled out. If it's not applicable, the private proponent should indicate or represent that it is not applicable. So next slide. So some general notes. If the required information is found in other submitted documents, it may be considered. For example, checklist requirement under the feasibility study is not provided in the feasibility study, but was provided in the completeness check form 1, so it's considered. If the required information or document is not applicable for the project, it must be clearly indicated, represented in the submissions. And then 3, all bases and references for assumptions used must be provided. So for in-house data, for internal estimates, a disclosure of such may be considered. And all the required forms and templates must be fully accomplished and submitted. Next slide. So the assessment of completeness of the PPP Center is within the 10 calendar days. including holidays and weekend. So the 10 calendar day period also include a clarificatory meeting with the private proponent, if applicable. So the project evaluation division and the private proponent can go through our initial findings and clarify if our findings were really not provided in the submission. So within the 10 calendar days, if complete, so the PPP Center shall endorse the USP to the appropriate IA and shall include in our endorsement letter the confirmation of its completeness and the determination of approving body. If incomplete, the PPP Center shall send a notice to the private proponent listing down the lacking requirements, including the lacking documents by the private proponent. And important to note, which was already discussed by Attorney Sai, that pursuant to PPP Governing Board Resolution Number 2024-0703, there is a 3-strike rule. So if a USP subsequently determined by the PPP Center to be incomplete for 3 times on separate occasions, may not be entertained for completeness check. So the proponent will be given 180 calendar days to refine its submission, and only after the lapse of 180 calendar days from the 3rd notice of incompleteness can the private proponent resubmit the USP to the PPP Center for completeness check. So the subsequent submission of the USP after the 180 calendar days shall be considered a new submission subject to a new 3-strike rule. Next slide. So in case the USP is same or similar to other proposals received by the PPP Center, so as stated in the PPP Code, the PPP Center may entertain the similar proposal within 10 calendar days from the receipt of the first USP, and such will be subject to completeness check. And if the PPP Center receive the similar proposal beyond the 10 calendar day period, it will no longer be assessed for completeness and shall be returned the private proponent. However, so the private proponents may instead participate in the cooperative challenge process. So next slide. So some pre-completeness check process to aid you in your preparation and eventual submission. Prior to submission of your USP to the PPP Center, you may request for a meeting with us through the Project Evaluation Division to clarify requirements in the completeness checklist, completeness check forms, or supporting documents needed in the PPIQ form. So the Project Evaluation Division is here to guide you in your submission. So to facilitate the discussion, we also encourage the private proponents to be specific in their questions to those items that they think they are unsure if the information or document is indeed complied or acceptable. So some proponents, there are instances they ask us if the supporting document establishing eligibility is acceptable. So next slide. And all USPs should be submitted in this portal, the unsolicited proposal submission portal. So take note that once the USP has been submitted, there will be no supplementary submissions. What is uploaded in the portal will be the only documents that will be assessed for completeness check. While the PPP Center is the entry point for all USP submissions, it's also good to note that the private proponent is not precluded from contacting your proposed IA. So what may be shared to you is at the discretion of the IA. based on their judgment of the information or readily accessible information. So I think that would be my last slide. I hope this discussion helps you in preparing your USP submission. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, JM. Let's give JM another round of virtual applause. All right, so before we move on to the open forum, we will be having a very quick break, no? So I know very information overloading ang ating our discussion earlier, no? So please be back here by 3:20. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the IRR is signed.
We have much to do in our efforts if we wish to further equip our workers or workforce with emerging and in-demand skills that are adaptive to the fast-paced and ever-changing domestic and global economy. With the proper implementation of this landmark act, we will facilitate stronger coordination and partnerships among relevant agencies and stakeholders to help implement programs to raise productivity. We will also strengthen the linkage between industry, the academy, and the government for the skills mismatches and enhance the competitiveness of Filipino workers. Next step is to develop the Trabaho Plan sa Bayan Act, which shall serve as the country's master plan for generating employment and creating high-quality jobs. To encourage our government partners, the private sector, and those employers as organizations, informal sector workers, and other vulnerable groups to actively participate in the upcoming consultations to develop this master plan.
Ang San Jose National Trade School ay talagang nakinabang ng gusto dito sa PSIP projects sa dahilang ito ay nagsilbing komportableng classroom sa ating mga estudyante.
Or na wala pa po ang PSIP, hindi namin alam kung saan kami lulugar, saan kami magtuturo.
Nagtsatsaga po kami na magturo sa mga kiosk sa loob ng gym, ano po. And then sa mga ilalim po ng puno, ganun po ang aming sitwasyon dito. Ngayon po, isang napakalaking pagkakataon po para sa amin na nagkaroon ng PSIP na kami ay pinagkalooban ng mga classroom.
Kung nang dumating ang PSIP, feeling namin nasa private school po kami. Napakaginhawa po ng naging naranasan ng mga guro, lalong-lalo na po ng mga mag-aaral po namin.
Napakabuti ng Panginoon Diyos at binigyan kami ng pagkakataon ng eskwelahan namin na nabigyan ng ganitong klaseng building.
Sabi nga kapag may komportable tayong classroom, silid-aralan, makakamit din natin o makakamit natin yung talagang quality education na hinahanap po natin. So, perfect po yun para sa amin. Meron kaming masisipag na mag-aaral, may matataas na pangarap ng mga mag-aaral, masisipag na mga guro, at dinagdagan pa po yun ng PSIP na napaka-komportabling classroom na building. So, talaga pong ang pangarap ng bata namin, abot kaya po nila.
Para sa mga susunod na mag-aaral ng ating sintang paaralan sa San Jose del Monte National Trade School, maging grateful po tayo dahil hindi na po natin kailangang magklase sa gym or sa baba o sa mga puno, sa mga half circle ng ating paaralan dahil meron na po tayong buildings or classroom na ating maaasahan.
Maraming salamat po sa pamamagitan ng proyektong ito, pinahalagan ninyo ang aming kinabukasan.
Maraming salamat po dahil hindi po isang paaralan po ang binago ninyo, ang napaunlad ninyo, kundi napakaraming buhay ng mga mag-aaral po at pangarap ang naisakatuparan niyo po.
Ladies and gentlemen, the IRR is signed.
We have much to do in our efforts if we wish to further equip our workers or workforce with emerging and in-demand skills that are adaptive to the fast-paced and ever-changing domestic and global economy. With the proper implementation of this landmark act, we will facilitate stronger coordination and partnerships among relevant agencies and stakeholders to help implement programs to raise productivity. We will also strengthen the linkage between industry, the academy, and the government to address skills mismatches and enhance the competitiveness of Filipino workers. Next step is to develop the Trabaho Plan sa Bayan Act, which shall serve as the country's master plan for generating employment and creating high-quality jobs. To encourage our government partners, the private sector, and those employers as organizations, informal sector workers, and other vulnerable groups to actively participate in the upcoming consultations to develop this master plan.
to our Zoom meeting room. If you're already here, can I see some reactions, heart reactions or thumbs up, so that we can see that all our participants are already here joining us. So we also have participants via Zoom and YouTube. So currently we have around 30 people watching from our live stream. Okay, so now we will proceed with our open forum. So may I request our resource persons, Attorney Sai and JM, to kindly join us for this open forum session. Right, so currently we have received a total of 4 questions. So if you do have questions later on and would like to ask them live, we will be asking you to raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you and ask you to unmute yourself. All right, so let's proceed with the first question. So for the first question, in section 7D of the BB Code, it says that the decision for appropriate approving body shall be rendered in writing within 120 calendar days from receipt of the complete requirements. Is this only applicable to projects amounting to 15 billion and up, or is it a general rule for all national PB projects? For instance, such as the 90-day project approval period for projects costing less than 15 billion can still go up to 120 calendar days if necessary. This is from the ADOP group, from Miss Melody Aitona.
Hello, I can take on this question. So the timeline for the approval period depends on who is the appropriate approving body. In case of national PPP projects where the appropriate approving body is the NEDO board, it's 120 calendar days, non-extendable. In case the approving body is in case approving body is the head of IA, governing board, or head of mother agency, as well as the ICC cabinet committee, the approval period is 90 calendar days, extendable up to 120. Now for local naman, the code and IRR states that the approval period is 120 days, non-extendable, similar to similar to national PPP projects where the AB is the NEDO board.
All right, thank you so much, Director John. So for our next question. Right, so this is from First Balfour. If an LGU engages in a joint venture with a private entity, but the agreement effectively functions as a PPP, such as featuring revenue sharing or long-term concession, should it still fall under the regulatory framework of the PPP code?
On this one, babalik tayo dun sa um, points for being a PPP as discussed by Attorney Sai. Remember in her discussion, a PPP is a project is considered as a PPP if first there's a contractual arrangement between the private partner and the government. Second, if the service or the good is usually provided by the public sector. Third is if the investment recovery scheme is linked to performance. And fourth is if there's a risk allocation among the parties. So if it's a PPP, it should follow the PPP process, especially for unsolicited proposal, where the entry point would be the PPP center. Now, we understand that the LGU or the implementing agency may have questions, PPP ba ito or hindi ba ito PPP? The parties can request for a non-policy matter opinion from the PPP center and provide you yung draft contract, terms of reference of the project, and our legal and the PPP center may provide guidance if the project is indeed a PPP or not.
All right, thank you so much. Now for our third question. So this is from the MPTM or Metro Pacific Tollways Mobility. So who will prepare the contract management plan?
The contract management plan, as envisioned in the PPP code and the IRR is to be prepared by the implementing agency. So the goal of that plan is basically to make sure that the covenants, the conditions precedent, or the obligations of the private partner are complied with.
All right, thank you, Director John. Now for the fourth question, this is again from Miss Melody of Arup Group. So for a USP under the following scenario, so OSP has been or OP has been granted already to the private proponent before the effectivity of the code, say in 2019. Now the proponent chose to pursue the project under the PP code and is currently under negotiation phase. Upon reaching a successful negotiation, will they still be required to renew their OP title, given that under the PEP code, the OP is only valid for 1 year upon conferment? So, or they can still use their initial OP and just directly proceed to submission of documents for project approval.
I can take on this question. So, RP Badilo here, no, from the Project Development Service. So, from what I understand, no, we're talking about a legacy unsolicited proposal wherein the original proponent status has been granted prior to the effectivity of the PPP code. So, based on the ating transitory provisions, no, if there is already an OPS granted and the project will proceed, no, accordingly, I guess, proceed to the next phases of the project, the OPS will retain its status. No? It will not expire after 1 year. Kumbaga valid pa rin, the OPS will still remain valid up until the conduct of the other phases of the project, no? Noting that the basic premise under the PPP code is that under the transitory provisions, all of the projects that have been granted OPS prior to the effectivity of the code must move along the project pipeline then, either continue the conduct of negotiation or after successful negotiation, reconfirm OPS and then submit the project for approval. So yeah, the short answer of that, no, is that the OPS will not expire if it was granted prior to the effectivity of the PPP code.
All right, thank you so much, Director RB. So again, Director RB is from the Project Development Service of the PEP Center. So next question, this is from Mr. Raymond Tan of the MWPV. So for water projects, how do we treat the right of way for the transmission lines? Are we going to include it in the valuation or only government property?
I'll take on this question. So recall that in our code in the IRR, if the government provides property, assets, or rights in case of unsolicited proposal, the government should receive appropriate compensation. Kaya doon importante yung valuation in case of government properties. Now, for this question, the right of way for transmission lines need only to be valued if that right of way is owned by the government, such that kailangan bayaran pabalik si government. Now, if the right of way is owned by another private entity, hindi na kailangan i-value yung ganong scenario since hindi na siya kailangan, there's no appropriate compensation needed for that to the government.
All right, thank you, Director John. Now, for our last question, we received via chat box. Is consultation with the PEP Center allowed before the submission of the unsolicited proposal?
Yes, the consultation with PPP centers allowed before submission of USP. Actually, we highly encourage private proponents, the private sector, to first meet with us to discuss yung checklists as MJ presented earlier. The meeting can also be, we can run through your documents if you have specific questions kung tama ba tong item na to, kung properly laid out ba or hindi. So we can provide appropriate guidance. The goal really is we are already familiar with your submission, and so once submitted to the USP submission portal, we can expedite yung completeness check. So rather than 10 calendar days, we can do it 5 because we're already familiar with the submission and we already did pre-completeness check of the proposal.
All right, thank you, Director John. So that's it for our questions for this round. So later on, we will still have another round of open forum. So if you do have questions or clarifications, please feel free to post them on the chat box and we will address them later on. So our RPs will still be here later for the second part of the open forum. And now, let's proceed with the next part of the lecture. This will be discussed by Director John, which is still on processing unsolicited proposals. So please, let's all welcome Director John Pronto.
Thank you, Kyle. So for this afternoon session, I'm gonna discuss the processing of unsolicited proposals. Next slide, please. My presentation will be in 4 parts. So MJ discussed earlier the process for completeness check. Now, what if the project is declared to be complete by the PPP Center and is now endorsed to the implementing agency? What are the next steps? So my presentation is outlined as number 1, initial processing and detailed evaluation by the implementing agency. And once the project is accepted by the implementing agency, it will proceed to negotiation, which will I discuss as well. After declaration of successful nego, the project will undergo review and approval. That's my third part of the discussion. And lastly, after the approval, we now go to the procurement of the project. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of PPP process for Unsol, which Director Sai already mentioned earlier. Now we first go discuss yung development stage for unsolicited proposals. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, after the 10-day completeness check by the PPP Center, the PPP Center will send out a letter endorsing the project, and the implementing agency will have 10 calendar days to decide whether to accept the PPP project or to reject the PPP project. The IRR provides guidance on how kung reject ba or accept yung proposal. First, if the implementing agency is not developing a solicited project, the implementing agency may continue processing the unsolicited proposal. The implementing agency as well may reject the unsolicited proposal even if hindi sila nagde-develop ng solicited because such project is not aligned with their development plans. Next slide, please. Now, what if the implementing agency is already developing a solicited proposal with similar scope and or objective? First, the implementing agency will have 10 calendar days to decide whether they will continue processing the unsol, but should they wish to continue processing the unsol, the IA should cease processing of the solicited project. Now, within 10 calendar days as well, the implementing agency may reject the unsolicited proposal and continue processing their solicited proposal. Ang key takeaway for these 2 slides is for the private proponent to set a meeting muna with the implementing agency to gauge their interest in the unsolicited proposal you will be submitting. Because, for example, we have had cases na the proposal submitted to us, we declared it complete, then we endorsed the implementing agency only for the implementing agency to reject the project because they are already developing a similar project. So our suggestion on the PPP Center to the private sector is to prevent those kind of happenings na i-reject naman pala ng implementing agency. Let's do a meeting muna with the implementing agency to gauge their interest, whether they want the unsolicited proposal or not. And that could also expedite the acceptance of the project to the development, to the detailed evaluation. Next slide, please. Ito yung discuss ko earlier, IA shall inform private proponent within 10 calendar days of their decision to proceed to DE or reject. In case of rejection, there should be corresponding justification for such rejection. So, example nga is they're already developing solicited, the project is not aligned with their objectives, or there's a similar project na that will occupy the same land, etc., etc. Now, on the bottom half side of this slide, I wish to reiterate this to the private sector. Last January, the PPPGB issued a PPP Governing Board Policy Matter opinion on what happens if the implementing agency has no action within the 10-day period. And during the deliberations of the PPPGB members, the guidance that we wish to provide is if IA has no action within 10-day period, the IA is deemed to have not decided to continue processing the USP. So the consequence of this is if the endorsed project will be delisted in the list of PPP projects. But of course, this is without prejudice to the private proponent can submit its unsolicited proposal anew, but it will be treated as a new proposal and will kick off another 10-day for the completeness check. On the footnote below, you can there's a link provided there for the PMO if you wish to read it. Next slide, please. Now, once the implementing agency decides to proceed to the detailed evaluation, the detailed evaluation will commence and it should be done within 90 calendar days. Should the implementing agency accepts the USP, they will issue the notice that they are ready to commence a negotiation no later than 3 days after the 90 calendar days. So such decision shall include the notice that the negotiation shall commence, the commencement date for the negotiation, mechanics for the nego, and the representatives of the IA to the negotiation committee. However, if the IA rejected the USP, all documents submitted shall be returned to the private proponent. The rejection letter shall be submitted 3 calendar days after the end of the detailed evaluation period. Now, the code in the IRR also provides that should the implementing agency not able to render its decision within 90 calendar days, the project will have another 90 plus calendar days before it is deemed to proceed to negotiation. So effectively, the detailed evaluation period would be 90 calendar days plus another 90 before it will proceed to before it will be deemed proceed to negotiation. However, please note that non-action from the IA within the first 90 calendar days is already exposing the implementing agency for penal provisions under the code and its IRR. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, after the release of acceptance of the project and notice to commence a negotiation, the negotiation will already kickstart. The implementing agency, in said letter, the implementing agency should include yung representatives nila in the negotiation committee. Such members should be designated by the head of IA through a special order. Now, any changes, yung second bullet sa implementing agency, Designated representatives must have the authority to negotiate and make decisions on behalf of the IA, because we have experienced instances where yung designated representatives is hindi pala sila empowered by the head of IA, such that the designated representatives cannot make decision on its own and needs to elevate the decision to the head of IA pa. So it's a friction sa negotiation period and introduces delays in the negotiation period. Any changes in the members of the nego committee should be issued through a special order. On the part of the implementing agency, the composition should be a team lead, officially headed by a person designated by the head of IA, a legal officer, finance officer, and technical officer. Because of course, during the negotiation, madaming aspects ng project i-discuss. It involves financial aspect, technical aspect, and legal aspect. So it's important on the part of the IA to have these officers. On the part of the private proponent, within 7 calendar days after receipt of the acceptance of the project, the private proponent shall issue a shall notify in writing the IA of its duly representatives to the negotiation committee and copy furnished the PPP Center. Now, the negotiation, next slide, please. Sorry, can you go back to previous slide? Now, the negotiation is a minimum of 30 calendar days, up to 80 calendar days, extendable to 150 calendar days. So depending on the complexity of the project may extend past 80 calendar days. But if mabilis naman yung negotiation, it can conclude dun sa minimum na 30 calendar days of the negotiation. Now, the IA during the negotiation may also involve the PPP Center, the DOF, government lawyers such as OSG, OGCC, or other prescribed statutory counsel to assist in the negotiation process. But this is not without prejudice for the DOF, PPP, OSG, and OGCC dun sa review of PPP contract nila of the project. Next slide, please. The code in the IRR also provides a provision that in case of unsolicited proposals, the IA may negotiate a share in the upside of the project. Share in the upside of the project may take on in many forms. It can be revenue share. It can be a fixed revenue share. It can be a variable revenue share, a fixed revenue share. Pwede din fixed for a certain period, 5 years, then graduating, increasing on the next subsequent years. In essence, the IA may negotiate an upside in the PPP project. So again, this is not a mandatory term for unsolicited proposals. This is only an option in the part of IA should they wish to have a share in the upside of the PPP project. There might also be instances where during the negotiation, napag-usapan na no need for the implementing agency to have a share in the upside. But during the approval stage, the appropriate approving body deems wants it as part of the PPCs, then it may be requested by the implementing agency for approval as a condition for approval. Next slide, please. Ito na yung sinabi ko earlier regarding the timeline. Nego period is 30, extend to 80 days, extendable to 150, depending on the complexity of the project. If the negotiation is successful, the IA shall grant the original proponent status to the private proponent, and it will be valid for a period of not exceeding 1 year. In case of failure of negotiation, the IA will reject shall reject the proposal in writing 7 calendar days after the end of the negotiation. Last January, the PPP Governing Board also approved the PPP GB guidelines on negotiation in case of unsolicited proposals. Our policy team are currently finalizing it, and it will be published soon in our website. Next slide, please. Now, regarding OPS, and ito yung madaming tanong from the private sector. When does may stop the clock period ba for the OPS? What if during the procurement period, nag-run ng procurement of project, does the OPS countdown still applies? The answer is no. The 1-year OPS validity stops once the invitation for comparative proposal is issued by the implementing agency. So that's important to note. So it means that during the approval period process, na ipapasa, for example, for NEDA or for local sanggunian, the OPS validity is still running. But upon upon approval of the IA and issuance of the invitation for comparative proposals, the 1 year is that 1 year timeline will stop. On the second bullet, expiration of OPS should in instances na hindi pa nag-start yung procurement challenge, for example, nasa approval period pa rin, the IA shall inform the private proponent na malapit na mag-expire yung OPS. On the expiration of OPS, letter B, ito yung what I stated earlier, that the validity of OPS stops, yung countdown of validity of OPS stops upon issuance of the invitation for comparative proposals. Lastly, on this slide is regarding the revocation of the OPS. If the implementing agency found that the facts disclosed by the private proponent are incomplete, incorrect, misleading, fraudulent, etc., it may be a ground for the IA to revoke the OPS. Furthermore, if the private partner committed acts that are not compliant or in violation of the code and the IRR, and if the original proponent changed its structure, that will affect yung legal, technical, and financial capability nila. Those instances are grounds for the implementing agency to revoke the OPS of the original proponent. After the end of the negotiation, once the OPS is granted, the IA and the private proponent within 30 calendar days should submit yung documents to the appropriate approving body for approval. Now, we have experiences. This is a key takeaway. We have experiences na pasok na yung 30 calendar days, but the project is not yet approved. It's not yet elevated or submitted to the appropriate approving body. In those instances, the implementing agency is already exposed under the penal provision of the PPP code and IRR. As a best practice for projects na nakakapag-comply ng submission within 30 calendar days, ang ginagawa is during the negotiation stage, both the implementing agency and the private proponent are already fine-tuning yung mga submissions, or editing the feasibility study, the PTC forms, etc., and the draft contract, such that after the negotiation, the documents for submission are already prepared and ready for submission to the approving body. Hindi yung after end of nego, doon palang gagawin yung documents. Next slide, please. Next is on the review and approval stage after the grant of the OPS. For this slide, this is already discussed by Director Sai earlier. Papasadahan ko lang. For national PPP projects, meron na tayong threshold, project cost threshold. For 15 billion and above, project cost threshold, the projects are to be approved by the NEDA board within 120 calendar days. If the project is below 15 billion, meaning the approval would be the appropriate approving body would be the head of IA or the governing board or the head of mother agency. The approval period would be 90 calendar days, extendable up to 120. But in cases that the project is below 15 billion, but it meets the 5 criteria as provided in Section 25, the approving body will be the ICC, and the approval period would be 90 calendar days, also extendable up to 120 calendar days. Now, for the local PPP projects, there are no cost thresholds. Regardless of amount, all projects are to be approved by the local sanggunian or the local university board. But before approval of the local sanggunian, the project should be confirmed first by the LDC or the local development council that it is in line with the development goals of the agency. And there are special circumstances where additional clearances are required. Additional clearance sa Regional Development Council is needed if the project will affect a national PPP project. Additional approval is also required on the part of the ICC if a local PPP would need national government undertakings or availability payments to be sourced from the national government budget. Next slide, please. For this one, I won't go through each of these items, but this is the minimum PTCs or parameters, terms, and conditions for PPP project. These are the PTCs as provided in the PTC Form 1 to be filled out by the implementing agency for submission to the approving body. So these are the items or PTCs that will form part of the deliberation of the implementing agency. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'll just go back to the previous slide for the minimum PTCs. I wish to reiterate here that the PTCs submitted to the PPP Center, it may change following the negotiation of between the IA and the implementing agency. For example, they want a higher revenue share, they want additional scope to the project. So the PTC submitted during the completeness check would change after the negotiation. And those negotiated PTCs will be the ones submitted to the approving body for deliberation. Now, of course, the approving body can deliberate on the project, and should they wish to add additional PTCs, they could do so for confirmation of the IA and the private proponent. And such PTCs will be the form that will be the basis in drafting the contract. Next slide, please. This is provided in the code and the IRR. So these are the criteria for approval of PPP projects. I just wish to highlight some items here. Of course, on the economic viability, it's important to show that the economic cash flows is above the hurdle rate, which is 10% social discount rate. The financial costs are properly converted to economic costs as discussed earlier by MJ. For the financial viability and sufficiency to service debt obligations, it's important to highlight there that the project cash flows are above the WACC, a weighted average cost of capital, or the cost of equity, and the cash flows are also above a certain threshold for DSCR, or debt service coverage ratio, usually at 1.2 times. The risk allocation complies with the GPRAM, but of course, on a project per project basis, there are some risks that may deviate from GPRAM. The important thing there is to provide a justification on the need for the deviation on the GPRAM. So this was also discussed by JM earlier. That's it on this slide. Next slide, please. So within the approval period, as I discussed earlier, um, if the approving body approves the PPP project, it shall within 10 calendar days issue a notice of approval to the implementing agency, copy furnished the PPP center. Next slide, please. In cases where the approving body fails to render its decision within the specified timeline, under the IRR, it is the PPP center that will notify the appropriate approving body and the IA that the approval period has lapsed and that the project is deemed approved. So once the letter from the PP center is received by the implementing agency, it is required within 7 calendar days to start the procurement process for such project. Next slide, please. Now, after the review and approval stage, we now go to the procurement stage. Next slide, please. On the procurement stage, first is the comparative challenge process. Remember that after the approval period, the approving body has 10 days to issue the notice of approval. So within 7 calendar days after issuance of such notice of approval, the PBAC shall release the invitation for comparative proposals. Such invitation for comparative proposals shall be posted in the website of the implementing agency and the website of the PPP Center. Within 20 calendar days, after the 7 calendar days, the IA shall prepare and issue the comparative challenge documents. So these documents are the instruction to bidders, draft contract, etc. We wish to highlight here a policy matter opinion issued by the PPP Governing Board last year, reiterating what is said in the IRR, in the code in the IRR, that the comparative challenge period shall commence upon simultaneous issuance of all comparative challenge documents. So under the PMO, it's also stated there that if for avoidance of doubt, if only one of the document is not issued, meaning, for example, out of the 5 documents, 4 documents lang yung na-issue, the comparative challenge will not commence. So all documents should be issued for the comparative challenge to commence. The comparative challenge period, as provided in the code in the IRR, is between 90 calendar days to 1 year. So it will depend on the complexity of the PPP project. Who will set the comparative challenge period? It is the approving body who will set it as part of the PTC, whether 90 calendar days, 180, 150, etc. But of course, before submitting it to the approving body, the implementing agency may have its own recommendation to the approving body on the duration of such period. Lastly, on this slide, after the end of the comparative challenge period, if there is a challenger, to the bid of the original proponent, the original proponent has the right to match the proposal submitted by the challenger within 30 calendar days. Next slide, please. On the issuance of invitation for comparative proposals, as I've stated earlier, it should be issued 7 calendar days after the issuance of the notice of approval. The minimum inclusions are presented here on the left, should be date and place to obtain the tender documents, objective and scope of the PPP project, contract duration, bidding period, participation fees, and deadline for submission. Such invitation are required to be published in the IA and the PPPC website, but in cases where the implementing agency has no own website, it may post it in other official digital platform. The IA also may publish it in a newspaper or international publication, but those are not required anymore. Next slide, please. So as I've discussed earlier, these are the comparative challenge documents. I wish to reiterate that the implementing agency should simultaneously issue these documents for the comparative challenge documents to commence. In case na left out yung isang document, upon issuance, the comparative challenge will not commence until the issuance of the last document. I wish to reiterate also here number 2. We have a period called a freeze period. So within 30 calendar days, 30 calendar days before the end of the comparative challenge period, there should be no new bid documents, bid bulletins, or changes thereto shall be issued. So meaning that 30 calendar days before end of comparative challenge, the final draft contract should already be issued to the prospective challengers. And the implementing agency should get the necessary clearances or approval of the draft contract before the issuance, before such freeze period. Next slide, please. On the conduct of comparative challenge process, the PBAC may decide whether it wishes to pursue the process through a two-stage process or a simultaneous or single-stage process. On the two-stage process, first, the implementing agency will evaluate the pre-qualification of the challenger within 10 calendar days. So it will evaluate the legal qualification of the challenger. If there are some challengers who are disqualified in this round, their technical and financial proposal will not be opened anymore. Only those proponents or challengers who pass the PQ stage will go to the technical proposal stage. So within 30 calendar days, the technical proposal will be opened. And again, only those who are deemed to comply with the requirements or with the conditions of the PBAC, those challengers, those are the challengers who will proceed to the financial proposal, etc., etc. Up until after the second document, opening of the financial proposal, and whoever, if there's a challenger, sorry, the second document or the financial proposal will be open for the challenger. Now, for the simultaneous or single stage process, this evaluation by the pre-qualification, technical and financial, the evaluation will be conducted within 45 calendar days. So I wish to reiterate dito sa two-stage process on the financial proposal. On the opening of the financial proposal, the bid of the challenger would be the one who would be the bid that will the OP should match. So next slide, please. On this slide, we wish to reiterate some few points. During the pre-qualification stage, the evaluation criteria used in pre-qualifying the original proponent should be the same criteria used in qualifying the challengers. So in the detailed evaluation period, remember that part of the role of the IA there is to evaluate um, the legal qualification of the implementing agent of the private proponent. So such condition or criteria used during the detailed evaluation should be similar to the criteria used to qualify the challengers. Second is the financial proposal of the OP shall be disclosed in the instruction for comparative proposals. So this will be the basically benchmark or basis for the potential challengers where the of course the potential challenger would exceed such a financial proposal by the original proponent. Again, any change in the composition of the OP shall be strictly prohibited. Remember that this is a ground for revocation of the OPS. And lastly, the comparative challenge shall be conducted either manually or electronically, as stated in the instruction to challengers, taken into consideration the nature and complexity of the PPP project. Next slide, please. On the right to match mechanism, so remember, during either in the two-stage process or in the simultaneous process, the opening of the financial proposal, it would reveal the bid of the challenger. And the OP will have 30 calendar days to match the bid put forth by the challenger. The contract is awarded to the OP if the original proponent was able to match such bid by the challenger. The contract will also be awarded to the OP if there is a tie between the bid between the OP and the comparative challenger. And lastly, if the government entity determines the financial proposal of the OP to be superior or more advantageous to government in case there is no challenger. Should the original proponent fail to match the financial proposal by the challenger, the contract shall be awarded to the challenger. Next slide, please. Next slide. On the review and approval of the draft contract, I've discussed this earlier, but on the timeline, the review and the approval of the draft contract is concurrently happening during the procurement stage process. So during the procurement stage process, the draft contract is being finalized by the implementing agency. So there may be various versions of the draft contract issued during the comparative challenge period because the IA is seeking the approval of the various evaluating units, the PPP Center, the Statutory Council, and the DOF. So in case of national PPP projects, the PPP Center is part of the reviewing body of such contract, whether the contract is compliant with the approved PTCs. Mandatory to be part of such reviewing committee is also, of course, the Statutory Council for compliance with all other applicable laws, rules, and regulations. So in case of national, these are OSG or OGCC. In case of local, these are the legal officers, statutory legal officers of the cities or municipality. In case a particular PPP project involves GU, government undertaking or availability payments, whether national or local, DOF is part of the reviewing committee. Again, I wish to reiterate here that the draft contract, there should be a final draft contract before 30 days before the end of the comparative challenge period, since the freeze period is already commencing 30 days before the end of the comparative challenge period. The PBAC shall not proceed with a bid submission unless a PPP contract is approved by the IA. So it's important to get the approval of the head of the IA of the draft contract before the freeze period commences. Next slide, please. On this one, I'll go through here lang. But after the end of the comparative challenge period, the PPAC shall submit to the head of the IA the recommendation to award the project 7 calendar days after the end of the procurement challenge. So if there's no bidder, if there's no challenger, the PPAC shall submit its recommendation within 7 calendar days after the end. But if there's a challenger, such recommendation to award shall be issued 7 calendar days after it is determined who is the most superior bid. Within 7 calendar days after receipt of the recommendation from the PBAC, the head of IA shall evaluate the recommendation of the PBAC, and after 3 calendar days shall sign and issue the notice of award to the winning private proponent. In the notice of award, it's included there the mandatory requirements or complete requirements before signing of the draft contract. So usually in the notice of award, there are still conditions that needs to be complied with by the private sector. And the private sector should be able to comply it within 20 calendar days upon receipt of the notice of award. If, for example, the private proponent fails to comply with those requirements, the notice of award will be automatically canceled and the bid security will be confiscated. Now, after within 5 days after submission of the requirements by the private proponent, the head of IA will determine compliance with the conditions stated, and after that, the contract signing may already commence. Next slide, please. This is what I've said earlier. So 5 calendar days after compliance with the conditions stated in the NOA, the contract may already be executed or signed with the head of IA and the private proponent. On the part of the private proponent, the signing entity may be the private proponent itself or the SPC, that special purpose vehicle or company that will take on the responsibilities of the private proponent. We wish to reiterate here that all original signed copy of the PPP contract shall be submitted by the IA to the approving body and PPP center within 5 calendar days after signing. Next slide, please. That's all for my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Director John. So once again, that is Director John of the Policy Formulation, Policy Evaluation, and Monitoring Service. So now we will proceed with the second part of the open forum. So now may I request again our resource persons, Director Sai, JM, and Director Pronto to kindly join us here for the open forum. Right, so we have received a ton of questions by the chat box, so we will be addressing them one by one. But if you do have a question that you'd like to raise live, you can raise your hand so that we can acknowledge you to tell us your question or clarification. Right, so let's proceed with the first question. Right, so this first question is from MWPD. So this is the follow-up question from the question earlier of Mr. Tan. So is valuation only for fixed assets such as land and building, or also for intangible assets such as water rights, bulk water service agreements with off-takers?
Thank you, Kyle. So I'll take on this question. For the purpose of PPP Center completeness check, we have indicated there's a checklist namin that the valuation to be submitted to the PPP Center is kahit sa fixed assets lang, on the land, building, properties, assets. Now, this is without prejudice to the implementing agency requiring the intangible asset to be valued during the detailed evaluation and the negotiation phases. So, for the PPP Center completeness check, what we only require is valuation of fixed assets.
All right, thank you, Director John. Now for the next question, this is from Arup Group. So please, can further details be provided on the level of social and environmental analysis required as part of the feasibility study at the development stage? So how do these requirements relate to the requirements of the DNR Administrative Order 2003-30 for the pre-feasibility and feasibility stages?
So I'll take this. The level of detail of the social and environmental studies depends on the size, nature, and complexity of the PPP project, but should comply with the requirements under the IRR and the relevant guidelines checklist. So depending on the complexity of the project and the preference of the IA, the requirements of the DAO 2003-30 may be adopted, which would cover the minimum environmental requirements mentioned.
All right, thank you, Attorney Sai. Now for the next question. This is from the Metro Pacific Water. So in Section 10 of the IRR, the implementing agency shall establish a PPP unit. So is this PPP unit the same unit who will be the representative of the IA in the negotiation?
Sige, I can answer this also. Not necessarily. The PPP unit is found in Section 10 of the IRR. It has a different set of preferred minimum members, and their negotiation is explicitly excluded from the list of tasks that they are charged to do. In both instances, the implementing agency should draft a special order or something to that effect, instituting the two separate units, because the body that is negotiating is likely going to be on a per project basis. But in any event, there is no explicit prohibition that the members could overlap. There's no explicit exclusion to that, but they are, strictly speaking, two separate bodies.
All right, thank you, Attorney Sai. Now for the next question. This is from One Document Corporation. So regarding the revocation of the OPS by the IA, is that acceptable when the PEP Center has already evaluated, reviewed, passed, and endorsed the USP to the implementing agency?
Thank you, Kyle. So I'll take on this question. We wish to reiterate lang dun sa timeline natin that what the PPP Center does is the assessment of completeness. So after the PPP Center deemed the project to be complete, we endorse it to the implementing agency. Then doon nangyayari yung detailed evaluation, nego, and only after the nego only after successful nego will the OPS be granted by the implementing agency to the private proponent. So the PPP Center has no involvement whatsoever regarding the revocation of OPS by IA.
All right, thank you so much, Director John. So now for the next question. This is from Arup again. So Section 93 of the IRR states that the PBAC shall release the invitation for comparative proposals within 7 calendar days from the issuance of the notice of approval. And Section 65 says that upon the issuance of the invitation for comparative proposals, the IA shall issue the tender document. However, Section 93 also mentions that within 20 calendar days after the said 7 calendar days above, the IA shall prepare and issue the comparative challenge document. Please advise whether the tender documents in Section 63 is the same as the comparative challenge documents in Section 93.
I'll take on this question. So the short answer is yes. Yung tender documents is same as the comparative challenge documents. So I wish to reiterate what I've discussed earlier, that the comparative challenge process will only start upon simultaneous issuance of those documents by the implementing agency.
All right, thank you, Director John. So now for the next question, let me just read. This is once again from Arup. So during the procurement stage, we understand that the PEP contract review and approval is taking place in parallel. Please confirm whether it is the implementing agency, the proponent, or the PEP center who is responsible in preparing the concession agreement. Or will it be a joint responsibility among those entities? If so, who will be leading? Finally, who shall approve and sign the concession agreement?
I'll take this question on. The entity who is responsible in preparing the concession agreement is the implementing agency. So after the approval of the project, there will be a PTC form that will be generated. And such PTCs will be the guide for the implementing agency to draft the PPP contract. Now that PPP contract will be the one to be subjected by a review of the PPP Center, DOF, OSG, OGCC, etc. And it is the responsibility of the head of the implementing agency to consider the comments of the various reviewing units. So essentially, it is not a joint responsibility. It is the sole responsibility of the implementing agency. The implementing agency shall also be the one to approve and sign the contract.
All right, thank you, Director John. Now for the next question. So this is from MPTM. So what timeline will be followed if there are no challengers during the comparative challenge stage?
So if there are no challengers, after the comparative challenge stage, the PBAC will endorse to the head of IA within 7 calendar days the decision or the recommendation to award the project to the original proponent.
All right, thank you, Director John. Another question. This is from the One Document Corporation. So PEP contract to be awarded, is the PEP contract to be awarded by the IA and PEP Center to issue guidelines to the IA in the contract preparation?
I'll take on this question. We have a form, a completeness check form 5 and PTC form 5, where we lists the mandatory provisions that should be in a draft PPP contract. So those provisions should be clearly stated or could be found in the draft PPP contract. So unfortunately, we don't have any template of a draft PPP contract, but those mandatory provisions should already provide guidance to the implementing agency and private proponent.
All right, thank you so much. Next question. This is from the MWPV. So for clarification, how do we treat the right of way for the transmission lines along national or local roads? For example, the MacArthur Highway. Are we going to include it in the valuation of the IA's contribution?
I'll take on this question. So I wish to reiterate my statement earlier that those assets owned by the implementing agency are need to be valued. So if those assets are not owned by the implementing agency, for example, these are owned by the private sector or by the private sector or other private entities, those assets need not to be valued.
All right, thank you so much, Director John. So that is our last question from the chat box. So in the interest of time, we will be cutting short our open forum at this point. So if you do have questions even after the session, you can still email us at info@pep.gov.ph for clarification and for so that we can send your questions to our resource persons for them to address. So once again, please let's give a warm virtual round of applause to our resource persons, Director Cyrus Ann Nang Santiago, Mr. J.M. Marquez, and Director John Tron. All right. So before we close this activity, we just have a few reminders from the team. All right. So just a few final reminders from us. So the presentation materials will be uploaded in the core site. So actually, it's already uploaded on the core site. Um, if you haven't checked out the core site yet, please do so even after the session. So please note that the core site shall be available for browsing and downloading of presentation slides and reference materials until March 13, 2025. So please, if you have visited it, you can download the presentation materials there that is uploaded. So please do not post on social media the presentation materials, but we do have shareable materials uploaded in the PEP Center's website. Also, may I remind everyone to please accomplish the activities evaluation form. So participants will be required to fill out the attendance and the evaluation forms to receive an e-certificate of attendance. Please note as well that the form is limited to one response per participant, and the deadline is on February 21, 2025. So after 1 month of this deadline, we will be sending the certificate of attendance to participants who have accomplished all the training requirements. Right? And now, this is again the core site. And now to officially close this session, may I now call on again the Director 3 of the Capacity Building and Knowledge Management Service, Attorney Cyrus Ann A. Nang Santiago.
Thank you, Kyle. So I will keep this brief. Good afternoon, everyone. As we conclude today's webinar on the fundamentals of unsolicited PPP proposals under the PPP Code and its IRR, I would like to express our heartfelt gratitude for all the participants for dedicating their time and attention to this half-day session. Being here with us shows your unwavering interest and commitment to the unwavering commitment of private partners and other stakeholders in advancing their knowledge on PPPs and processes outlined in the PPP Code, its IRR, and other relevant guidelines. We are pleased to have latest count 132, but that might be there may be more. Participants from the private sector, key stakeholders, and the general public who tuned in via Zoom and Facebook live stream. We also acknowledge my fellow resource speakers today, Director John Pronto and Mr. J.M. Marquez, for sharing their valuable knowledge and for adequately responding to questions and clarifications from our participants. We hope that this activity has been insightful and provided you with valuable knowledge that you can apply to your respective roles in your institutions. Recalling our activity objectives for this OCBA, we hope it has made you more familiar with the processes undertaken in unsolicited PPP proposals under the new legal framework. Additionally, we expect that you now understand your roles and your roles and that of your IA counterparts, the roles that they will play in the PPP process, as well as that of the government in the review and evaluation of unsolicited proposals. On the part of the PPP Center, we will also take note of the questions and clarifications raised and consider this in further improving the enabling environment for PPPs. We recognize your role in operationalizing the PPP Code and its IRR and existing guidelines in support of this legal framework are valuable so that together we can identify and address areas of improvement to optimize the PPP process for both the implementing agency and the private sector. Should you have any additional questions or clarifications, as mentioned, you may always reach out to us through the various channels so we can respond or refer to your queries to the appropriate entities to provide you with the necessary answers. Once again, thank you for your time and active participation. We look forward to seeing you once again in upcoming capacity building activities and other future PPP endeavors. Have a great rest of the day to everyone. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Attorney Sai. And now, may I invite everyone to please turn on your camera so we can immortalize this moment, so we can capture this with a quick photo opportunity. Right, so my colleagues here will be taking the photo. Right, so I'll give you a few seconds to open your cameras. All right. Okay, so please hold your smiles for a few seconds. All right, so 1, 2, 3, smile. One more. All right, so one more. And the last one. All right, thank you so much, everyone. And I hope that you're able to gather many ideas and information and insights from this activity. So we will see you in our next capacity building activities and your next projects, perhaps. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.